to the Romans. He was nothing compared to Medo-Persia, nothing compared to the Greece of Alexander the Great. Another thing to consider is that Antiochus certainly did not wax exceeding great towards the south. Anybody gets into history sees this right away. His march to the south to Egypt was stopped by the mere word of an unarmed Roman officer. That's how weak this guy was. When Antiochus said he would think about the Romans' demand, the Roman drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus, and he told him he would do his thinking within that circle. And what did Antiochus do? Did he step out of the circle and knock that Roman over and continue on? No. He turned and fled. So he was frightened out of Egypt by an unarmed representative of Rome. Not to mention, the Jews later routed him. And so, really, to apply this prophecy of a world power, a superpower, which waxed exceeding great towards the south, to this cruel, and he was cruel, but very weak man, well, friends, it's used merely to avoid or explain away this prophecy as being fulfilled by papal Rome. And we discovered that. That's the Counter-Reformation, you know, instead of the historicism view of prophecy, and that's the principle used to interpret Bible prophecy, they came out with preterism and futurism to try to point eyes away from what the Bible's teaching, who this little horn power is. Another thing about Antiochus is that his push to the east resulted in his death. He certainly didn't wax exceeding great in that direction. Daniel 8 verse 25 says in part, he shall also stand up against the prince of princes. And that's speaking about Christ, as we'll find out. Little hint, we'll find out in just a moment. But Antiochus died 164 years before Christ. But we know that it was Rome that had Jesus crucified and had opposed his people. It wasn't Antiochus Epiphanes. And there are more things that show that Antiochus just doesn't meet the specifications of this prophecy for the little horn. But this is enough to show that he just isn't the little horn described in this chapter, or chapter 7. But who is this little horn of Daniel 8? Notice what Hykes says. You can find this on the internet at thesourcehh.org. Hykes says this, quote, is the little horn represented by heaven as denoting both pagan and papal Rome? Indeed, pagan and papal Rome are counted as one entity in Daniel and Revelation, as others have so recognized. In Daniel chapter 7, verses 8, 20, 24, and 24, the little horn, the papacy, is represented as coming out of the fourth beast, pagan Rome. It is a continuation or part of pagan Rome. In Daniel 8, the little horn power finds its fulfillment only in pagan and papal Rome combined. Heaven counts them as one. In Daniel 11, the king of the north, and we'll find this out as we go further on in our studies, Daniel, of the book of Daniel, the king of the north represents both pagan and papal Rome. Both are termed the king of the north. In Revelation 12, verses 3 and 4, the dragon power that endeavors to destroy the Christ child was pagan Rome. However, verses 13 to 16 reveal that during the 1260 years, the dragon cast a flood of water out of its mouth to sweep away the woman. This was during the reign of papal Rome. Thus, the dragon power of Revelation 12 is also both pagan and papal Rome. All generally recognize that the little horn in Daniel 8 verse 9 has two phases, yet is counted as one in the eyes of heaven. And we'll find that to be true. Let me share this with you. Let me share a few quotes with you here. This one's out of the Sign of the Times article, November 1st, 1899. Quote, through paganism and then through the papacy, Satan exerted his power for many centuries in an effort to blot from the earth God's faithful witnesses. Pagans and papists were actuated by the same dragon spirit. They differed only in that the papacy, making a pretense of serving God, was the more dangerous and cruel foe. Through the agency of Romanism, Satan took the world captive. The professed Church of God was swept into the ranks of this delusion. And for more than 1,000 years, the people of God suffered under the dragon's ire. And when the papacy, robbed of its strength, was forced to desist from persecution. Powerful statement there. So we see it's pagan and then transformed into papal Rome. Goldstein says in his 1844 Made Simple, his book, page 35-36, he says, quote, "Clearly, the little horn of Daniel 8 is Rome." The evidence is overwhelming. Here's one last one I want to share from A.T. Jones. Alonzo T. Jones, Consecrated Way to Christian Perfection, page 95. Notice what he says. He says, quote, "We have seen that in the 7th chapter of Daniel, the little horn, though as such representing only the latter phase of Rome, yet does really represent Rome in both its phases, Rome from beginning to end. Because when the time comes that the little horn is to be broken and destroyed, it is indeed the beast that is slain and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame." He quotes out Revelation. So, who's this little horn? It's Rome in both of its phases, pagan and papal Rome. So Daniel goes on there, and he says the little horn is said to wax exceeding great towards the south, he says, and towards the east, and towards the pleasant land, or glory land, or we'd say Israel. Well, very well documented history reveals that these are the three directions of the compass where the Roman Empire grew into the world power that it became. Towards the south, Egypt was for a long time an unofficial protectorate of Rome. They're the ones that kicked out Epiphanes, you recall, Antiochus Epiphanes. Rome there, they were a protectorate of Rome, you see. Her fate was already in Rome's hands in 168 BC. Like I said, when Antiochus Epiphanes, who was seeking to make war on the Ptolemies, was ordered out of the country. Egypt was still under the administration of its Ptolemaic rulers, the new pharaohs, if you remember. It was a pawn of Roman Eastern policy for many years before it became, in 30 BC, a Roman province. And then towards the east, the Seleucid Empire lost its westernmost lands to Rome as early as 190 BC. Finally became the Roman province of Syria in 65 BC. And towards the pleasant or glory land, Palestine or Israel, it was incorporated into the Roman Empire in 63 BC. And I shared a lot more about that when we studied Daniel chapter 7. But let me share what Farrell says in the book of Daniel, page 96. He says, quote, "The little horn comes out of one of the four winds. It came out of the west wind, having arisen in the Italian peninsula." Remember the Etruscans, where they were located? West, some central Italy. He says, arisen in the Italian peninsula and expanded toward the south, Carthage and Egypt, in the east, the Grecian Empire, end quote. That's what Farrell says in his book. And so this is where this little horn comes from and who it is. Now let's go to Daniel 8 and verse 10. How are we doing on time? Well, we need to move along, don't we? We need to move along. Daniel 8 and verse 10. "And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them." It is remarkable, some of the theories that people come up with when they study God's Word. But we need to define these things because people go off on all these different ideas that just don't come together. It just makes no sense. And so the ram and the he-goat fought each other geographically or horizontally, right? We've seen that. The first conquests of the little horn were also geographical under imperial Rome. But then suddenly this battle changes to the cosmic vertical plane. In other words, at first all the conquests are on earth. The controversy is with earthly powers. Verse 9 is referring to the conquests of the pagan Roman Empire or imperial Rome, like I said. And as we've seen, Rome did indeed conquer to the south, Egypt to the east, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, to the pleasant land. A euphemism for the land of Israel. Notice this, Bible Research Institute, Symposium on Daniel, Volume 2, page 507. Notice what they say, quote, by way of introduction to the little horn, it should be noted that its activities are described in a series of 3 separate scenes. The first phase of its activities is described in verse 9, where it is seen as extending out in 3 directions to the south, to the east, to the glorious land or Palestine. The second phase of its activities is described in verse 10. In this scene, it is described as reaching up to the stars, the host of heaven, casting some of them down to the earth and trampling upon them. The third scene in the little horn is seen to reach up to heaven again. This time, however, it encounters the prince of the host. While there's no description of personal harm or injury being done to the prince, his tamid, or continual, daily ministration is taken away from him, and the place of foundation of his sanctuary is cast down to the earth, evidently by the little horn. End quote. There's a lot to learn there. But the little horn, which had been conquering horizontally on earth, now began an onslaught vertically to heaven. The sense of the first part of verse 10 is the horn grew geographically, yes, even vertically into heaven. Imagine Daniel seeing this, he's like, wow, what? The horn grows great, even to the host of heaven. It hurls down some of the host of the stars to the ground. It tramples upon them, like Alexander stamped upon the Persians as one enraged. More about that in a moment. Something that I do want to share with you, though, that whenever the expression wax great, it's the word gadal. But whenever that's used in the Old Testament describing human beings, without exception, friends, it refers to someone who takes power illegally, presumptuously, and arrogantly. In the Old Testament, the word host is used in the majority of cases to describe armies. And so the question is, what's meant by the host of heaven or army of heaven? Well, let me share 3 possibilities, and we'll figure it out. 3 possibilities. One possibility is that the hosts or stars of heaven can refer to angels. And there are a number of instances you can look that up. Nehemiah and Judges, Job, Revelation 12. So that's one. They could mean or refer to angels. A second possibility is that the hosts or stars is a reference to the literal sun, moon, and stars. You know, Deuteronomy 4, 2 Kings 17. Yeah, maybe. A third possibility is that the host or the stars represent God's people on earth. Now, having seen those 3, which one do you think it's talking about here? We've got to remember the context. Well, actually, the explanation at the end of chapter 8 of Daniel leaves no doubt as to the identity of the host of heaven upon which the little horn tramples. If you look at Daniel 8, verse 24, it says, quote, "And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper in practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people." Well, is that the angels? Is that the sun, moon, and stars? Or is that God's people? The explanation portion of the vision of Daniel follows the identical order as the vision itself. Let's look at it. Let's look at it. And I'm just going to kind of paraphrase it a little bit. We'll look at it here. In the vision, you have a ram with two horns, verses 3 and 4. You have a he-goat with a notable horn, which is broken, succeeded by 4 horns. That's verses 5 through 8. And then the little horn attacks the host, verse 10. And finally, the prince of the host, verse 11. The angel interpreter at the end of the vision explains that the two-horned ram represents the Medes and Persians. That's verse 20. He then states that the he-goat represents Greece, and its notable horn is the first king. That's verse 21. Next, he informs us that the 4 horns represent the divisions of Greece after the death of its first king. Alexander the Great dies. That's verse 22. Finally, he explains that a king will arise, verse 23, who will destroy the mighty and the holy people, verse 24, and stand up against the prince of the host, or the prince of princes, verse 25. Even a passing glance at Daniel 8 will indicate that the host and the stars in the vision stands in the same identical spot as the mighty and the holy people in the explanation of the vision. And so it's clear that the host represent God's people. You know, and we look at some of the things, for example, like Paul. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul even uses military terminology to describe the armor and the warfare of God's people against Satan's kingdom. You can look up Ephesians 6, Romans 13, 2 Corinthians 6, 1 Thessalonians 5, 2 Corinthians 10. Look at all those references. You see it. Now, let's go back to Hikes. Notice what Hikes says here about this. She says, quote, "The host of heaven is the people of God." Exodus 12, verse 41, and she quotes it, "And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day, it came to pass that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt." And then she says, those being persecuted are God's people, described by Philippians 3:20 as having their citizenship in heaven. Now I want you to notice what Bunch says in his book of Daniel, page 117. Notice what Tyler Bunch says. He says, quote, "The host and the stars that were cast down to the earth and destroyed by the papacy are clearly identified as the saints of God and their leaders. The host of heaven are all who assist Christ in the work of redemption, including the saints who belong to the family of heaven and whose names are enrolled in the New Jerusalem. Angels are called the Lord's host, and Christ the captain of the Lord's host. The rulers of Israel were said to be over the host of the Lord, and were called the officers of the host. In scores of places, God's people are called the host, and that the Lord of hosts mustereth the host of the battle. If we use the Bible as its own interpreter, let's do that, friends, right? Let's use the Bible as its own interpreter. He says we must believe that the host of Daniel 8 represents God's people, that the stars who were cast down and destroyed by the papacy represent the officers and leaders of the saints or host. There can be no question. Stars are often used in the scriptures to represent leaders. Lucifer is called the daily star, and in Revelation 22:16, Christ is called the bright and morning star. Of him, prophecy said, there shall come a star out of Jacob, Numbers 24:17. The crown of 12 stars on the woman of Revelation 12:1, who was symbolic of Christ's bride or church, represents the leadership or rulership of the 12 apostles. The elders or ministers of the 7 churches of Revelation 2 and 3 are represented as stars, 7 stars in the right hand of Christ. Those who are prominent or outstanding in any calling are called stars, end quote. That's what Bunch says. And so, notice that in the explanation of the vision, the little horn is described as a king in verse 23. So we go on here. And more specifically called the King of the North, chapter 11, which I've mentioned before. The use of the word king doesn't have to mean that the Antichrist will be a single individual person. Some people get really hung up on that. You know? Now, why would I say it doesn't mean that it will be a single individual person? Well, let me give some examples. Okay? It's always good. Let me give some examples from the Scriptures. In the Bible, the singular word priest, for example, with a definite article can mean a succession of priests. Likewise, the word king with a definite article can mean a succession of kings. Even the word man with a definite article can mean Christians of all time. Notice 2 Timothy 3 and verse 17, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. Who would the man of God be, if not meaning all who are followers of God, right? In Mark 2:27, when Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, he obviously didn't mean that it was made for only one man, but rather for mankind. And so this helps us understand why Paul called the Antichrist the man of sin, and why the beast has the number of a man, Revelation 13:18. The singular word woman with the definite article can also refer to the church of all ages. So really it's clear that the word king in Daniel 8 can refer to a succession of kings in a dynasty. So, you know, some people, especially with futurism, talking about the Antichrist being one man, or preterism saying, oh, it's that one man Antichrist Epiphanes. No. Now, Daniel says that this little horn stamped upon them. Stamped upon them. Did we hear that before? This has references to the fury with which Rome has persecuted the people of God so often throughout the centuries. In the days of the tyrants, Nero, Decius, Diocletian, in pagan times, and again in papal times, Rome has never hesitated to deal harshly and wickedly with those whom she chooses to condemn. Remember, Alexander was enraged against the Persians and stamped upon them with an intense fury, and we see a much greater power here, Rome, with the full measure of Satan's spirit, enraged at God and his people. Revelation 12 and verse 17 says, and the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. The Greek word there, translated in English as wrath, is orgizo. Means to provoke or enrage, that is, passively become exasperated, be angry, wroth, right? The remnant will feel, friends, the full measure of Satan's enraged anger, and would destroy them completely, if not for Jesus cutting it short and returning to earth for the redeemed. Praise his holy name for that, friends. Praise his name. There, let me share this quote, Bible Research Institute, Symposium on Daniel, Volume 2, page 513. Quote, the action is set in the stellar heavens. The little horn exalts itself against the starry host of heaven. In this third scene, it is seen as coming in conflict with the prince or leader of that same host. This prince, therefore, has a relationship to the heavenly sphere. The horn's action of casting the truth down to the ground is described in this section too. Thus, the location from which it is cast down should be, by way of contrast, heaven. These factors contribute to the conclusion that the action of this final scene is set in heaven, just as the action is in the preceding scene. End quote. It's interesting what Shea says about this in his Daniel, a Reader's Guide, page 179. He says, quote, "The little horn reaches up to heaven, which is the vertical dimension, and then he throws down the stars to the earth in the other direction. But he is not content with merely throwing the stars down to the earth. He goes on to trample upon them, crushing them." End quote. And so liken it to what we've seen Alexander do to the Persians. There is a hatred, a deep hatred. Alexander had a deep hatred for the Persians. He stamped upon them, crushed them to the ground. Daniel says in chapter 7, crushed them to the residue under his feet, this beast of Rome. You get an idea? This hatred that Satan has for God and God's people, anything to do with God. Let's go on to Daniel 8, verse 11. It says, "Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily," sacrifice is added, "him the daily was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down." I want you to notice a subtle change in the way the little horn is described here. It's no longer called it, but now the gender is he. Why do you think that is? Because there was a vast change in Rome as it changed from pagan Rome to papal Rome. No longer conquering on the horizontal plane, we read here, as pagan Rome, but now magnifying himself as the sole representative of God on earth, as papal Rome. It's not it reaches up to heaven vertically, he reaches up vertically to heaven. Paul says, 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 4, "Who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he," Paul says, "as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." There's a change. He magnified himself. It's a subtle change. We've got to catch it. It means a lot. Notice this. Mansell, in his book, Open Secrets of the Antichrist, page 58. He says, quote, "The papal authorities claim that the Roman pontiff is of so great dignity and power that he forms one and the same tribunal with Christ, exalts the Pope to position as high as the Prince of the host, Jesus Christ," end quote. Back to the BRI, Bible Research Institute, in their synod, pages 399, 401. Notice what they say in this symposium. Quote, "The focus of verses 11 to 12 continues to be on the upward vertical movements of the little horn as it intrudes into the affairs of the heavenly realities. The horn magnifies itself against the Prince of the host, Christ. This is done by arrogating or claiming to itself divine prerogatives and by attempting to nullify Christ's heavenly priestly ministry of forgiveness and salvation." Make note of that. This is what is meant by this. Let me say that again. This is done by claiming to itself divine prerogatives and by attempting to nullify Christ's heavenly priestly ministry of forgiveness and salvation. It casts God's revealed truth to the ground, and for a time is seen to practice and to prosper in its endeavors. Some historicist interpreters attempt to find a parallel fulfillment for each specification in Daniel 8, verses 9 through 12, for the two phases of political pagan and ecclesiastical papal Rome. We suggest that there is no simultaneous or dual fulfillment here, but rather sequential. Sequential fulfillment means that verses 9 and 10 are fulfilled by the pagan pre-medieval phase of Rome, whereas verses 11 and 12 are fulfilled by papal ecclesiastical Rome. Accordingly, Daniel 8, verses 9 to 12 finds its fulfillment sequentially in Rome, with verses 9 through 10 in its political pagan phase and verses 11 and 12 in its ecclesiastical papal phase. End quote. Did you catch that? Prince of the host, he exalts himself, Paul said. He casts God's truth to the ground. God's Christ's heavenly priestly ministry of forgiveness and salvation. Well, let's look at who the Prince of the Host is and try to wrap this up for now. Who is this Prince of the Host in verse 11? It's been said that the book of Revelation could be called the book of the Lamb because of the frequency with which that designation occurs in a Revelation. As a parallel, the book of Daniel could be titled the book of the Prince. First, we meet him as the divine-like being in the earthly context, Daniel 3, with the three Hebrew worthies there. Then, by way of contrast, we meet him as a human-like being in the heavenly context of Daniel 7, verse 13 to 14, as he is being given dominion. Next, he's the Prince of the Host, engaged in a struggle over the heavenly sanctuary and its ministration here in Daniel chapter 8. Chapter 9, he appears as the Prince of the Covenant, the Prince of Sufferers. Chapter 10, he's Michael, who wrestles with the ancient Persian kings over the fate of his people. Once again, and for a final time, he will engage in such a struggle when he stands up after the judgment to take the dominion and rulership over the eternal kingdom of God, according to chapters 12. And again, chapter 7, talking about the judgment and receiving the kingdom. Now, the only other place in the entire Bible where the specific name Prince of the Host, Sar-Saba, where it's used in the Bible, is in Joshua chapter 5, 13 to verse 15. Let's read that. Joshua 5, verse 13 to 15. And it came to pass, when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes, and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him, with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him, and said unto him, Art thou for us, or for our adversaries? And the reply was, and he said, Nay, but as captain. And that word is sar. It means prince, ruler, leader, chief, chieftain, official. Or here translate, captain. As captain of the host of the Lord am I now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and did worship, and said unto him, that should be a key, that this is not an angel, by the way. He fell to the earth and worshipped, and said unto him, What saith my Lord unto his servant? And the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, Loose thy shoe from off thy foot, for the place whereupon thou standest, it is holy. And Joshua did so. We know that the Lord had appeared to Moses at Horeb in Exodus 3, as he was about to start the task of delivering Israel from the house of bondage, right? And so now, as Joshua began the conquest of Canaan, the Lord appeared to the new leader of his people to assure him of victory and of success. This passage reveals that the Prince of the Host is God. There can be no doubt that the Son of Man, Michael, the angel of the Lord, the angel of his presence, all refer to the same being. I mean, you read those in Jude 9, Revelation 12, 1 Thessalonians 4. It's very interesting that the high priest in the Old Testament, I bet you didn't know this, but he was occasionally called prince. Did you know that? Notice that the prince is the prince of the host. If the host is composed of the saints of the Most High, then the prince of the host must be who? The commander of those saints, right? And who is the commander of God's people on earth? Jesus is the head of the church, isn't he? The church receives its marching orders from him. And you will notice that those who belong to God are called saints in both Testaments, Old and New. Daniel 7, Psalm 30, Psalm 149, Ephesians 1, they're called saints. Philippians 1, Colossians 1, Jude 3, on and on and on. In Daniel 7, we're told that the little horn blasphemes God. It's very clear. It said, Daniel 7, verse 25. But in what sense in chapter 8 does this little horn or beast speak blasphemies against God? Well, Daniel 8 provides the answer, but in distinction to Daniel 7, we're not told that the little horn speaks blasphemies against the Most High. Rather, I'm talking about chapter 8, we're told that the little horn attempted to supplant or take the place of the prince of the host by taking away the daily ministration from him. Verse 11. Thus the little horn's blasphemy consists in the act of trying to supplant or take the place of the prince of the host and to continue in his stead, in his work. As if it wasn't enough to war against the host, the little horn now attacks the prince of the host, the daily, which belongs to the prince, in the place of the prince's sanctuary. Dowkin says this in his Daniel Vision of the End, pages 37 and 38. Notice he says, quote, the reference to the high priest is repetitively connoted in the word prince, sar. The word sar points to the high priest in many texts of the Old Testament. Within the book of Daniel, sar refers to Michael, whose garments are of linen, are reminiscent, get this, are reminiscent of the Day of Atonement, the only day the priest was thus dressed, end quote. Remember I told you about those two animals, the ram and the he-goat? They're a part of the sanctuary services specifically used in the Day of Atonement services. Now, as I end this series, this study here, let's talk about that word daily, the daily, the word tamid. What does this strange word mean? There's presently an intense debate about its meaning. Well, there has been for a good while. Some think it refers to paganism, which was taken out of the way in order to give way to the papacy. And for years, I was strictly of that line of thinking. But friends, with more knowledge comes spiritual growth. Others believe that it refers to the removal by the papacy of the continual ministry of Christ in the heavenly sanctuary. The problem in this verse is that the word daily is an adjective which stands alone and has no noun to qualify it. The question to be answered is, excuse me, the little horn takes away the daily what? Right? The meaning of the word daily is simply something which goes on continuously without interruption. That's what it means, the word self. But you see, it's important to keep in mind that this word is accompanied by the definite article. It is the daily, which changes it to hatamid, which the little horn takes away. He takes away hatamid. Again, King James Version adds the word sacrifice, thinking that tamid refers to the morning and evening sacrifice, but that's a wrong assumption. There's already a Hebrew expression for that sacrifice. It's olah tamid. So what then does the word daily mean here in this verse? take a very close look the next time that we get together in our studies here. I appreciate that you hung in there with me. Let's have a word of prayer together. Bow our heads. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for your holy word and for sharing this truth with us and helping us to put the puzzle pieces of prophecy together using right biblical principles, letting the Bible explain itself. I'm also appreciative of those who have protected historical documented history through the ages. I know your hand was in that. I praise you for that. And for those scholars that help us, bless them. And thank you so much for Jesus, who loves us so much. He gave up everything so that we might be saved and be in the family again. Please continue to be with us. Be with those who maybe have heard these things for the first time. Help them to have understanding. Lead them back to the previous studies, Lord, that they may come to a right conclusion. May we all be found worthy when Jesus returns. I pray this in his blessed name. For he is so worthy. Amen and amen. I want to thank you for being with me. I want to encourage